Today we're going to be looking at 3 cameras with 3 different autofocus systems. We got the Sony a7 III with a hybrid system, the Panasonic G9 with a contrast-based system with a twist, and the Canon EOS R, which uses Canon's famous dual-pixel CMOS autofocus. Now I have a few goals for this video based on some of the misconceptions I want to tackle. First, I want to reduce some of the perceived disparity between phase detect and contrast detect based autofocus systems. Everyone seems to think that phase detect is awesome and the way of the future and contrast detection is terrible and is a dinosaur, and that simply isn't true. 2, I want to explain what makes Canon's dual-pixel autofocus so special and how the new EOS R has improved upon it. And 3, I want to tell you why the Panasonic G9 is the fastest focusing consumer camera out there. 4, I'm going to answer a subscriber question about autofocusing points and if having a lot of them is important. And lastly, number 5, I want you to leave this video feeling like you know which autofocusing system is the right fit for you and how to best use it. And I hope to do all this in under 15 minutes. Let's get undone. What is happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and let's talk autofocus. But before we do that, let's just take a quick minute to thank Camera Canada for hooking us up with the EOS R so that I can show you tangible results when it comes to the dual-pixel autofocus. They have the EOS Rs in stock now, so if you're Canadian like me and you want to get your filthy mitts on the new Canon, make sure you check out Camera Canada. Links will be in the description below. Alright, so let's talk about what I keep hearing when I watch camera reviews or read blogs and forums, which is that contrast detection sucks and phase detect autofocus is where it's at. In fact, when the new Panasonic full frames were announced at Photokina, one of the most repeated lines I heard was how they were disappointed that they opted for contrast detection instead of upgrading to phase detection. But the first thought that always enters my head when I hear things like that is, you know the Panasonic G9, a contrast-based system, is the fastest focusing camera out there, right? It's also the most accurate focusing camera I've ever used, and these sentiments can be extended to all of the new modern Panasonic models. However, there are some things that it's not that great at, such as tracking fast-moving subjects and locking on after a transition. And this is logical if you know how contrast detection works, and it's also where phase detection beats it. But that doesn't mean we should be immediately disappointed when we hear that a camera uses contrast detection. And to prove that, let's quickly talk about how these two different systems work. So phase detection is all about bringing two slightly different perspectives into alignment at the right time. Similar to what we talked about in previous videos about rays converging, phase detection is a method of achieving focus by shifting the overlap until it starts to line up perfectly or comes back into phase. And this is how most DSLRs work in photo mode, and they actually have a separate sensor dedicated to this task. Because the mirror is blocking this from being done on the actual image sensor, a secondary reflection is taking place that bounces this down onto the AF sensor so that you can focus before you actually take the picture and lift the mirror. And this system was the standard for action, sports, and wildlife photographers because of its innate advantages when it comes to speed. And the reason why phase detection is quick in this way is because knowing how something is out of phase allows for 2 other variables to be known as well. Which way the focus is out, as in is it too far forward or too far back, and how far out of focus is it. And knowing these 2 things allows the camera to make a rapid movement in the right direction and with conviction. This was much different than contrast detection, which also existed on these DSLRs, but only when live view was enabled and the mirror was locked up. If the mirror is up and you're reporting directly to the image sensor, then there's no way to bounce a duplicate image down to the AF sensor. So those cameras had to use a different on-sensor solution called contrast detection. The idea behind contrast detection is the camera analyzes the image as it sees it and moves the focus back and forth until it achieves the best contrast. This is more like how you edit your photos and videos when it comes to sliders. You probably start out with a bit too much and then you pull it back a bit and then you add a little bit more until you find that right amount, that sweet spot that you like the best. But contrast detection was very dependent on the quality and the power of the camera's processors, and in earlier models this meant much worse performance when compared to the dedicated phase detect AF sensor. This led to a pretty obvious disparity where you'd be using your DSLR in photo mode and you could track a flying bird, but then when you switched it over to video or live view, you would get a much different experience. So this led to the conclusion that contrast detection sucks and phase detection rules, right? Well, no. There's serious pros and cons to both, and we already talked about the pros of phase detection, so what are some of its cons? Well, it's less accurate, especially when it came to DSLRs. Because the focusing wasn't being done on the image sensor, it was much more vulnerable to lens inconsistencies and micro-shifting of the hardware. This is why many camera and lens combinations needed to be calibrated and have focus adjustments stored in order to prevent front or back focusing. These errors aren't possible with contrast detection because the analysis takes place on the image sensor itself and the calculations are based on the final image. Also, because of the requirement for incoming light to be reflected down through a translucent mirror component to hit the dedicated AF sensor, phase detection had hard limits on what f-stops it could work under. If your lens was too slow or you used the wrong combinations of adapters and teleconverters, autofocus would be labored, if not impossible. Now, while light is important in all autofocusing systems, contrast detection is based more upon visible contrast, and it doesn't really care how narrow your aperture is. So this makes Contrast AF a more versatile system when it comes to various shooting conditions, but contrast detection has its limitations as well. It doesn't have the ability to know how far from correct focus it is, or in what direction it needs to move like phase detection does. So it's a bit more of a guessing game. It goes in one direction and sees if it's better or worse, and if it's better, it goes more and more, getting better and better until it starts to get worse, and then it backs off a bit until it finds that perfect position. This is what creates that pulsing when contrast detection is hunting, or when using certain detection modes in video shooting. It can't lock on to good focus as easily as phase detection because it's never quite sure. Phase detection can just go and say, yep, I'm in focus, stop doing things now, where contrast detection has to constantly check to make sure it's in the best position possible because it doesn't know if the focus is better unless it compared it to something worse over and over and over again. But at that time, contrast detection was the only option for video, even if phase detection could potentially give a more pleasing result by transitioning correctly and then stopping. But the cool features like face tracking and the other detection modes generally only worked in contrast detection because they too were based on calculations being done on the actual image sensor and didn't integrate well with that separate phase detection sensor. Now this is where mirrorless cameras differ. Because there's no mirror box, there's obviously no way to bounce the image down to a dedicated AF sensor, so manufacturers started putting the phase detection components right on the image sensor. And this improved one of the major problems with phase detection by reducing the likelihood of having a focus misalignment from having that separate autofocusing sensor and that lens variance that we were talking about earlier. The calculations were being done right on the image sensor just like with contrast detection, and this opened up the door for the other computational modes like face detection and tracking to be used with face detection and not just contrast detection anymore. But the early incarnations of this weren't the greatest due to the less than stellar implementation and the missing horsepower needed to drive such a system because the camera processors just weren't as good as they are now. It also continued to highlight a fact about autofocus, which is that you can do it quickly or you can do it accurately. And despite all the advances, while phase detection was definitely faster, contrast detection was still more accurate. Basically, despite all the hate that contrast detection receives, if your subject isn't moving, contrast detection will produce a better focus, period. If you shoot products and stage scenes like me, phase detection is irrelevant and somewhat undesired. So those were the facts of life up until not that long ago. But these three cameras that I mentioned in the beginning of the video showed the different approaches that the manufacturers have taken to overcome those limitations. The first solution was a hybrid system, and I'm sure you've heard the term hybrid AF before, but basically all it means is that it incorporates both autofocus systems. Hybrid systems were around even in DSLRs, but of course they were only engaged when in live view and still used regular contrast detection. But some of the image capture pixels on the sensor were replaced with autofocus ones that would make phase detection calculations. The idea was to let the initial focus happen with phase detection so that we get moving in the right direction and know approximately how far to go, and then fine-tune it with contrast detection. That way it wouldn't be as slow as normal contrast detection because it wouldn't have to do its hunting all the way up just at the very end, but we could get some of that accuracy from contrast detection at the end where it fine-tuned it and found the best possible focusing position. It seemed like the best of both worlds. To Canon, however, this seemed like a waste of sensor real estate for something that they couldn't use in photo mode, that didn't perform as well as their dedicated AF sensor, and still required contrast detection in order to complete the focus. Their solution, of course, was their dual pixel autofocus, which incorporates phase detection into nearly every pixel. Each one of these pixels has two photodiodes which create the phase difference data. It's as if each pixel has two mathematical perspectives, thus dual pixel. This allowed for much more efficient results than the sporadically placed AF pixels in the hybrid systems without giving up any image capture pixels in the process. It also allowed for much more computational data for the phase detection to work with, similar to what you'd get from a full contrast detection sensor readout. This meant full implementation of features like face tracking using the data range of contrast detection but at the speed of phase detection. This made Canon comfortable enough to move forward with a completely phase detection based system with no reliance on contrast detection. Dual pixel also provided a more balanced experience in low light by addressing some of the tougher scenarios for contrast detection like bright lights in a night environment. So overall, dual pixel autofocus is an important and impressively balanced development from Canon, but it's not perfect. First, it's not quite as accurate as the dedicated contrast detection systems, and it's also not quite as fast as the hybrid systems out today that have less data to crunch and better processors to crunch it with, because the processor department is something that Canon is lagging further and further behind in. But the new EOS R does address one of the issues from the DSLR days by enabling dual pixel autofocus in photo mode. Canon moving to mirrorless means you no longer have to use a dedicated AF sensor and thus miss out on those extra features when not using live view. It's dual pixel all the time. Now this will mean some adapting and probably some kinks will need to be worked out for the sports and wildlife shooters moving over from DSLRs because the systems do feel a little bit different, but I think this is definitely a step in the right direction. Dual pixel AF is fantastic for video because of the gorgeous focus transitions that make for really natural racks and pulls, plus it has stability in focus once the transition is complete without any pulsing because it doesn't rely on contrast detection. And it's here where the hybrid AF systems suffer a little bit. Despite Sony and more recently Fuji offering autofocus systems with great capabilities, their video AF, while quick and reliable, still has a bit of harshness to it, almost as if you can see the hybrid action occurring. It's like you'll get a fast bit and then a slow bit, and the fast bit is really fast, faster than Canon, and that's pretty impressive. But then it's almost too fast for its own good if you want a more natural look. Outside of that though, these modern hybrid systems are fantastic, and they're probably my favorite of the three, with Sony being the pathmaker for innovation in that area. Because of their better processors and their more manageable data range, which is created by combining the two AF systems, these hybrid cameras are the only ones that are able to do both reliable continuous eye detection and near perfect lock-on tracking. Their video autofocus, as I said, is fast and locks on well, and their high burst rate photo modes provide more keepers than the other two systems. But the Panasonic G9, a contrast-only system, is still faster and more accurate when it comes to low movement, single shot focusing because of something called depth from defocus. Panasonic's depth from defocus, or DFD, is like the reverse of Canon's dual pixel. Canon found a way to make a fast system more accurate and generate more data, where Panasonic found a way to make an accurate system faster. If we look at speed graphs demonstrating the way that AF systems work, a phase detection system would be a straight line that goes from out of focus to in focus over time, with a slightly larger range of error. But a contrast-based system would be more of a wiggly line that might even go the wrong way to start, and then kind of wiggle its way up, and it would take longer, but it would have a smaller range of error, and it might even have to overshoot a little bit before coming back to find the perfect line of focus. Panasonic's depth from defocus system, however, would graph more like this, which is much closer to what you'd see from a hybrid AF system. It'd be a straight line and then a little wiggle at the top. Now, on the hybrid systems, the straight line is generated by the phase detection, getting you most of the way there, and then a little contrast detection to finish it off. But in the Panasonic depth from defocus, this straight line is generated differently. It's instead generated by having stored computational data of the paired lens, allowing the system to skip the initial hunting and jump straight to the finish line. Basically, the Panasonic cameras quickly examine the near and far focusing data and compare it against the known qualities of that lens to determine which direction and how far to move the focus. And because Panasonic cameras have a track record of hosting impressive processors, it can make these calculations very quickly, faster than phase detection systems can figure out phase differences. There's one major limitation with DFD though, which is that it only works with Panasonic's own lenses because of that requirement of having that focusing database. That doesn't mean, however, that if you put on a lens that isn't made by Panasonic, that the focusing speed just goes right in the toilet. Make no mistake, this is not your grandpappy's contrast detection. It's improved dramatically over the years. It just means you're not the fastest gun in the West anymore if you take off that Panasonic glass. Unfortunately though, depth from defocus does not completely fix two of the most common limitations of contrast detection. It's better, but still not the best at tracking fast-moving subjects because it still needs to do that back and forth assurance test at the end, which can mean missed shots. That being said though, I have seen significant improvement in this area over the years, and I think that right now it's a lot better than people are giving it credit for. The second thing the DFD hasn't completely fixed is that pulsing in video recording because it doesn't have that one and done approach that phase detection has. It does, however, have nice tap to focus transitions when recording video, in my opinion. A quick side note for curious people, yes, this does actually address some of the variance you see in autofocus performance when you're using different lenses. Because these different systems have different techniques for achieving focus, some lenses are going to perform better than others. For instance, for a full-on sports-style phase detection technique, you'd want a lens that can move glass quickly and with a single movement. But for supreme accuracy in a classic contrast detection scenario, you want a lens that can sweep through the focal range smoothly and with finer adjustments to find that perfect sweet spot of focus. The final underappreciated trait for contrast detection, which has only started to be matched recently, is the greater coverage you get for autofocus points. With DSLRs using a dedicated AF sensor, you'd often be limited in the amount of points and placement unless you got a pro or prosumer body, and even then, they didn't match anywhere near the 100% coverage of a contrast detection system. And in order to explain why this is important, I'm going to answer a question I have from a viewer here named Ruben, who asked if having more autofocus points really did anything, and if it made for a sharper image, or if it was just wasteful to have more than, say, 50 points. So the short answer is no. Having many autofocus points does not affect sharpness, but if your image is out of focus, then obviously it won't be sharp. Basically, all an autofocus point does is provide a point in the frame that can be focused on, and the more points that you have, the more flexibility you have in choosing where you want to focus. This has some obvious advantages. For instance, say you wanted to track a moving subject and you didn't want to move the camera, or you physically couldn't keep up with or predict the movement of that subject. Having more focus points would allow you to better track the subject through the frame than if you had fewer. If you imagine that you had a small group of points in the center and your subject moved back and to the left, you'd have no way of focusing on them unless you recomposed. So when it comes to the marketing component of your question, Ruben, I think what companies are trying to say when they advertise having hundreds of focus points is, look how much of the frame we can cover. You can track an object all the way through the frame. and you can focus on any element you want to. And this is great even if you're not shooting action because of the weaknesses of the focus recompose technique. Focus recompose, for those that don't know, is when you focus on something, say using the center point, and then you change the position of your camera because you want to frame it up differently, but you keep the focus where it was when you focused on that subject when it was in the center of the frame. And this was the only way to really do it when you only had a couple of focus points. But this has always been a bit of a problem because lens elements aren't flat like the final image, they're spherical. And because of this, focusing and recomposing in the modern era with cameras that have hundreds of focus points is a pretty silly practice. It might seem minor, but the variance in distances between the center and the corners of your frame due to the curvature of your lens can have a larger than expected impact on your subject's sharpness. So this is one instance where having more focus points could actually affect the sharpness of your final image. So it's best to compose first and then select the focus point that falls best on your subject. And the more focus points that you have and the more coverage that those points have across the sensor, the better capability you'll have to do this. So I hope that answers your question, Ruben. In my opinion, having more focusing points and more coverage is not marketing BS, but a better tool to be able to achieve the focus you want using the composition that you prefer. And this, like I said, was an area that contrast detection has been best at for many years. Dual pixel was definitely a step up for Canon, but again was limited to only being able to use it in live view and was limited to about 80% of the frame. Hybrid systems have since closed the gap, however, with many models this year reaching numbers in the 90s and up to 100% coverage. But this is another issue that the EOS R has addressed for Canon, because not only does it have coverage up to 88% in one dimension and 100% in the other, but this coverage is available in both photo and video, something that was lacking in the DSLRs. In conclusion, we've come a long way in terms of autofocus, and much of the old information on autofocus systems is just that. Old. Contrast detection is actually a fantastic option if high-speed movement and tracking are not a concern, and it's the preferred method for accuracy, which is why it's still used in the most advanced hybrid systems. Hybrid systems which offer incredible features and functionality like continuous IAF and record high keeper rates for action photography. So it's going to be easier to address my fifth goal for this video by excluding all of the scenarios where the focusing type doesn't really matter. If you're in a landscape, still life, staged portraits, or product photography, etc., I believe that any of these modern systems will give you surprisingly fast and reliable AF performance. So I'd concern myself more with the other features on that camera and make sure they're giving you what you need instead, because contrast detection will not be a limitation to you in any way for that type of photography, and in many ways will actually be an advantage. If you're into action with erratic subjects, birds, sports, etc., a modern hybrid system wins in my opinion hands down. The Sony a7 III, the a9, and the newer Fujis like the X-T3 are going to give you incredible results. You'll have the speed and accuracy you need to have the best keeper rate money can buy, and after that, it's on you. I'd also recommend a good hybrid system if you're a video shooter or vlogger who wants to be in front of the camera and wants instant focus when they point it around at things. If you're behind the camera and you want top quality video processing, you'll often find that these cameras come with contrast detection, but that should be fine because you're probably going for maximum control anyway. Lastly, if you want a really easy all-rounder that performs well in most scenarios, whether it be photo or video, I'd go with Canon's dual pixel. While not as accurate as some, and while not the absolute fastest, it's probably the best balanced AF system out there and has plenty of potential for any type of shooting. It gives the smoothest and the most pleasing results when it comes to video, and the EOS R represents Canon's best implementation of this system to date. But honestly, we're in great times here when it comes to autofocus. There's so many great systems and so much innovation that I think a lot of unnecessary hypercriticism is put on autofocus, especially when it doesn't affect our bottom lines like it would for, say, a professional sports or wedding photographer. Cameras aren't perfect. Autofocus isn't perfect, and we can't demand perfection from them because of the very way that they function. What we can do is use them like tools, understand how they work, and try and find the best tool for the job and the best way to use it in that situation. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. All right, I'm done.